In the sweltering heat of August 1844, something sinister was happening behind the pristine white doors of Henderson Medical Practice in Millfield, Georgia. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Over the course of 18 months, 67 patients walked through those doors seeking healing, only to meet their deaths under circumstances so suspicious that even the undertaker began asking questions. What started as whispered concerns among grieving families would eventually expose one of the most calculated and horrifying medical murder schemes in American history. Dr. William Henderson was not just any physician. He was Millfield's most trusted doctor, a man whose gentle bedside manner and apparent dedication to his patients had earned him the respect of the entire community. But beneath his caring facade lurked a monster whose greed knew no bounds, a man who had turned the sacred oath to do no harm into a twisted business model built on death and deception. The year 1844 was a time of tremendous change in Georgia. The state was experiencing rapid growth as cotton plantations expanded westward, bringing new wealth to some while leaving others struggling to survive in an increasingly competitive economy. Millfield, a modest town nestled along the Oconee River, had grown from a small trading post into a thriving community of nearly 2,000 residents. The town boasted 3 churches, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and most importantly for our story, Henderson Medical Practice, the only medical facility serving the surrounding countryside. Dr. William Henderson had arrived in Millfield in the spring of 1842, carrying impressive credentials from the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta. At 32 years old, he presented himself as a dedicated physician who had chosen to serve rural communities, rather than pursue the lucrative urban practice that his education could have afforded him. The townspeople were immediately impressed by his modern medical knowledge, his extensive collection of surgical instruments, and his willingness to make house calls at any hour of the day or night. Henderson established his practice in a 2-story brick building on Main Street, with examination rooms on the ground floor and his living quarters above. He hired Martha Sullivan, a widow in her 40s, to serve as his assistant and housekeeper. Martha had lost her husband in a farming accident 2 years earlier and was grateful for steady employment that allowed her to support her 2 young children. She found Dr. Henderson to be a demanding but fair employer, though she would later recall that he seemed unusually interested in the personal finances of his patients. What Martha and the rest of Millfield did not know was that Dr. Henderson had not come to their town out of altruistic motives. He had fled Augusta under a cloud of suspicion after several of his patients there had died under questionable circumstances. No formal charges had been filed, but whispers among his medical colleagues had made it impossible for him to maintain his practice. Millfield represented a fresh start, a place where his reputation was clean and his past unknown. Henderson's first few months in Millfield were spent building trust and establishing relationships with the local community. He treated minor ailments with competence, delivered babies without incident, and even performed several successful surgeries that saved lives and enhanced his reputation. But beneath this legitimate medical practice, Henderson was carefully studying his patients, identifying those who carried life insurance policies, and assessing their financial worth to their families. The life insurance industry was still relatively new in 1844, but it was growing rapidly as Americans became more aware of the financial security such policies could provide. Companies like the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York had begun selling policies throughout the South, and many families in Millfield had purchased coverage to protect their loved ones. What they did not realize was that their trusted physician was viewing these policies not as protection for families, but as opportunities for profit. Henderson's method was as simple as it was diabolical. He would identify patients with substantial life insurance coverage, then gradually poison them using substances that would mimic natural illnesses. His medical training allowed him to recognize which symptoms would appear normal to grieving families and local authorities who lacked his specialized knowledge. He was particularly skilled at using arsenic, a readily available poison that, when administered in small doses over time, would cause symptoms resembling various common ailments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The doctor's first victim was Thomas Mitchell, a prosperous farmer who had purchased a $1,000 life insurance policy to protect his wife and 3 children. Mitchell came to Henderson in October 1842 complaining of stomach pains and general weakness. Henderson diagnosed him with a digestive disorder and prescribed a series of treatments that required weekly visits to the clinic. Over the course of 6 weeks, Mitchell's condition steadily worsened despite Henderson's apparent efforts to help him. He died on November 18, 1842, leaving behind a grieving family and a substantial insurance payout. Mitchell's death was viewed as a tragedy, but not a suspicious event. Henderson had documented his treatment carefully, and his medical notes showed a progression of symptoms that seemed consistent with various digestive ailments that were poorly understood at the time. The local minister praised Henderson's dedication to his patient, noting how the doctor had worked tirelessly to save Mitchell's life. The insurance company paid the claim without question, and Mitchell's widow was able to maintain the family farm. Encouraged by his success, Henderson began identifying other potential victims. His next target was Rebecca Davis, a merchant's wife who had been struggling with what appeared to be consumption. Davis had a $500 policy, and her husband had consulted Henderson about her declining health. Henderson assured the family that he could provide treatments that would ease her suffering, but warned that her condition was quite serious. Over the next 2 months, Davis received regular treatments from Henderson, each one containing carefully measured doses of poison. She died in January 1843, and once again, her death was attributed to the natural progression of her illness. As Henderson's scheme continued, he became increasingly bold and systematic in his approach. He kept detailed records not only of his patients' medical conditions, but also of their insurance coverage, family financial situations, and potential for generating profit through their deaths. He developed relationships with insurance agents in neighboring towns, presenting himself as a physician who could provide thorough medical examinations for policy applicants. This allowed him to identify new victims before they even became his patients. Henderson's method evolved as he gained experience. He learned to vary his techniques, sometimes using quick-acting poisons for patients whose deaths needed to appear sudden, and other times employing slow-acting substances that would create the appearance of a lingering illness. He became skilled at manipulating symptoms to match various diseases, and his medical expertise allowed him to provide convincing explanations for the progression of each victim's condition. The doctor also began targeting patients who were already suffering from legitimate health problems, reasoning that their deaths would appear even more natural. He would take on patients with heart conditions, respiratory problems, or other serious ailments, then accelerate their decline through carefully administered poisons. This approach provided him with perfect cover, as grieving families were already prepared for the possibility of death and were grateful for Henderson's apparent efforts to provide comfort during their loved ones' final days. By the summer of 1843, Henderson had killed 12 people and collected portions of insurance payouts totaling over $8,000. His method for obtaining money from the insurance claims was as calculated as his murder technique. He would present himself to grieving families as a caring physician who was willing to help them navigate the complex process of filing insurance claims. He would offer to handle the paperwork, communicate with insurance companies, and even advance money to families while they waited for their claims to be processed. In exchange, he would retain a percentage of the final payout as compensation. for his services. Most families were grateful for Henderson's assistance during their time of grief and readily agreed to his arrangements. They viewed his fee as reasonable compensation for services that would have been difficult for them to handle on their own. What they did not realize was that Henderson was not simply helping them collect money that was rightfully theirs, but was actively causing the deaths that generated these payments. Henderson's growing wealth allowed him to expand his practice and enhance his standing in the community. He purchased new medical equipment, upgraded his facilities, and even began making charitable contributions to local churches and community organizations. His apparent success and generosity further enhanced his reputation and made it even less likely that anyone would suspect his true activities. The doctor's confidence in his scheme led him to become increasingly ambitious in his target selection. He began pursuing patients with larger insurance policies, sometimes worth several $1,000s each. He also started targeting multiple members of the same family, reasoning that the deaths would appear to be the result of contagious diseases or genetic predispositions. This approach allowed him to maximize his profits while maintaining the appearance of natural causes. One of Henderson's most audacious crimes involved the Patterson family, who had moved to Millfield from South Carolina. In early 1844, John Patterson was a skilled carpenter who had purchased a $1,500 life insurance policy shortly after arriving in town. His wife, Caroline, had a smaller policy worth $500, and their teenage son, Michael, was covered under a family policy that would pay $300 in the event of his death. Henderson identified the Patterson family as ideal targets during a routine examination when John came to the clinic complaining of back pain from his carpentry work. During the consultation, Henderson skillfully steered the conversation toward the family's financial situation and learned about their insurance coverage. He began treating John for his back problems while simultaneously developing a plan to eliminate the entire family. Henderson's approach with the Pattersons demonstrated the full sophistication of his murderous scheme. He began by treating John's back condition with a series of injections that contained both legitimate pain medication and carefully measured doses of poison. John's condition initially seemed to improve, which enhanced Henderson's credibility with the family and encouraged them to trust his judgment completely. After several weeks of treatment, Henderson informed the family that John's back problems might be related to a more serious underlying condition that could affect other family members. He recommended that Caroline and Michael undergo preventive treatments to protect them from developing similar problems. The family, trusting Henderson's medical expertise and grateful for his apparent concern for their welfare, readily agreed to his recommendations. Over the course of 3 months, Henderson systematically poisoned all 3 members of the Patterson family. He staggered their deaths to avoid suspicion, with John dying first in June 1844, followed by Caroline in July, and finally Michael in early August. Each death was attributed to different but plausible medical causes, and Henderson's detailed medical records provided seemingly convincing evidence that he had done everything possible to save his patients. The Patterson family deaths generated insurance payouts, totaling $2,300, the largest amount Henderson had collected from a single family. The tragedy devastated the Millfield community, and Henderson was praised for his tireless efforts to save the family despite the apparent genetic predisposition that had claimed all 3 lives. Several community members even suggested that the town should recognize Henderson's dedication with some form of official commendation. But Henderson's success with the Patterson family would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The deaths of 3 family members within such a short time period, combined with the growing number of deaths among Henderson's patients, began to attract attention from unexpected sources. Martha Sullivan, Henderson's assistant, had begun to notice patterns in the doctor's practice that troubled her deeply, though she had not yet fully understood their sinister implications. Martha Sullivan had always prided herself on being observant, Working as Dr. Henderson's assistant for over 2 years had taught her to notice the smallest details about patient care, medication preparation, and the doctor's daily routines. But in the autumn of 1844, Martha began observing things that made her increasingly uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite articulate why certain patterns troubled her so deeply. The first thing that struck Martha as unusual was Dr. Henderson's medicine cabinet. Unlike other physicians she had worked with in the past, Henderson kept certain medications locked in a separate cabinet that only he could access. When Martha asked about these special medicines, Henderson explained that they were experimental treatments that required careful handling and precise dosing. He warned her never to touch these bottles, claiming that some of the substances could be dangerous if handled improperly. Martha accepted this explanation initially, but she began to notice that Henderson used these special medicines primarily with patients who seemed to have substantial financial resources. She also observed that patients who received treatments from the locked cabinet often experienced unusual symptoms that didn't seem to match their original ailments. Some would complain of stomach cramps, excessive thirst, or strange metallic tastes in their mouths during their treatment sessions. Another pattern that troubled Martha was Henderson's unusual interest in his patients' personal finances. Most physicians focused exclusively on medical symptoms and treatments, but Henderson routinely asked detailed questions about insurance policies, family savings, and property ownership. He would often spend more time discussing financial matters than medical conditions, and Martha noticed that he kept separate files containing information about patients' economic circumstances rather than just their health records. Henderson's behavior toward certain patients also seemed inconsistent with his reputation as a caring physician. While he maintained his gentle bedside manner in public, Martha observed him displaying cold, calculating attitudes when he thought no one was watching. She once overheard him muttering about profitable cases and worthwhile investments while reviewing patient files, language that seemed completely inappropriate for a medical practice. The most disturbing observation Martha made involved Henderson's nighttime activities. On several occasions, she had returned to the clinic after hours to retrieve forgotten items or complete urgent tasks, only to find Henderson working alone in his private office with materials spread across his desk. When she entered unexpectedly, Henderson would quickly cover his work and claim he was simply catching up on routine paperwork. However, Martha caught glimpses of what appeared to be insurance documents, financial calculations, and patient lists, organized in ways that had nothing to do with medical care. Martha's growing suspicions were reinforced by conversations she overheard between Henderson and visitors who came to the clinic during evening hours. These men were well-dressed strangers who spoke in hushed tones about arrangements, payouts, and processing claims. Martha never heard complete conversations, but the fragments she caught suggested that Henderson was involved in business dealings that extended far beyond medical practice. The most troubling incident occurred in September 1844, when Martha accidentally discovered Henderson preparing medications in his private office rather than in the main treatment room where such work was normally done. She entered the office without knocking and found Henderson mixing powders from unmarked containers into bottles that were labeled as standard medicines. When Henderson realized he had been observed, his usual calm demeanor vanished, and he harshly ordered Martha to leave immediately and never enter his private office without permission again. That same week, Martha began paying closer attention to the patients who received Henderson's special treatments. She noticed that many of these individuals shared certain characteristics beyond their apparent wealth. They were often people who lived alone or had small families, making their deaths less likely to attract extensive scrutiny. They were typically suffering from conditions that could plausibly worsen over time, providing natural explanations for their eventual deaths. Most significantly, they were patients who had recently obtained life insurance policies or had existing coverage worth substantial amounts. Henderson's treatment of these patients followed a predictable pattern that Martha began to recognize. The doctor would initially provide legitimate medical care that showed genuine improvement in the patient's condition. This early success would build tremendous trust and confidence, encouraging patients to continue with whatever treatments Henderson recommended. After establishing this trust, Henderson would introduce new medications or procedures that he claimed were necessary to prevent complications or ensure complete recovery. During this second phase of treatment, Martha observed that patients' conditions would begin to deteriorate in ways that seemed inconsistent with their original ailments. They would develop new symptoms that Henderson would explain as expected. Complications or signs that more aggressive treatment was needed. The doctor would increase the frequency of treatments and often suggest that patients stay at the clinic for extended periods to receive round-the-clock care. The final phase was always the same. Despite Henderson's apparent best efforts and most advanced treatments, the patient would continue to decline until death became inevitable. Henderson would express profound grief at losing patients he had worked so hard to save, and he would often provide comfort and support to grieving families during their time of loss. His compassionate response to these deaths only enhanced his reputation and made families more grateful for his care. Martha began keeping her own private records of these patterns, though she wasn't entirely sure what she hoped to accomplish. She documented which patients received special treatments, how long their treatment courses lasted, and what symptoms they developed. She also noted Henderson's behavior during different phases of treatment and recorded fragments of conversations she overheard between the doctor and his mysterious evening visitors. As Martha's unofficial investigation continued, she discovered that Henderson maintained correspondence with insurance agents and companies throughout Georgia and neighboring states. She found letters in which Henderson provided medical evaluations for insurance applicants, often recommending approval for policies that other physicians might have questioned. She also found correspondence suggesting that Henderson received commissions or fees for referring clients to specific insurance companies. These discoveries led Martha to realize that Henderson's scheme was far more sophisticated than simply murdering patients for insurance money. He was actively involved in helping people obtain life insurance policies, often providing medical examinations that understated health risks or failed to identify conditions that should have disqualified applicants. By helping unhealthy people obtain coverage they shouldn't have qualified for, Henderson created a pool of potential victims whose deaths would appear to be the natural result of pre-existing conditions. Martha's investigation revealed that Henderson had also developed relationships with several undertakers and coroners in the region. He would often recommend specific funeral directors to grieving families, claiming that these professionals provided superior services during difficult times. Martha discovered that these undertakers were willing to conduct minimal examinations of deceased patients and rarely questioned Henderson's determinations about causes of death. The scope of Henderson's network became even clearer when Martha found evidence of his involvement with lawyers who specialized in helping families collect insurance benefits. Henderson would recommend these attorneys to bereaved families, presenting their services as necessary for navigating complex legal requirements. The lawyers would handle all aspects of claim processing, allowing families to receive their benefits quickly while ensuring that Henderson received his share of the proceeds. Martha also discovered that Henderson had been documenting his crimes in a coded journal that he kept hidden in his private office. The journal contained detailed records of each victim, including their insurance coverage, the methods used to kill them, and the profits generated from their deaths. Henderson had developed an elaborate coding system that disguised the true nature of his activities. But Martha's background in bookkeeping allowed her to recognize that the entries represented some form of financial accounting. The coded journal revealed the full extent of Henderson's murderous enterprise. By September 1844, he had killed 43 people and collected over $30,000 in insurance-related profits. The journal also contained plans for future victims and notes about improving his methods to avoid detection. Most chillingly, the journal included calculations showing how much money Henderson expected to generate from each planned murder. As Martha pieced together the evidence of Henderson's crimes, she faced the terrible realization that she had been unknowingly assisting a mass murderer for over 2 years. Every medication she had prepared, every patient file she had organized, and every appointment she had scheduled had potentially contributed to Henderson's ability to kill innocent people. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, but Martha knew she had to find a way to stop Henderson before he could claim more victims. Martha's position as Henderson's trusted assistant provided her with access to evidence that would never be available to outside investigators, but it also placed her in extraordinary personal danger. If Henderson discovered that she had uncovered his scheme, Martha had no doubt that she would become his next victim. She began taking careful precautions to avoid arousing Henderson's suspicions while continuing to gather evidence that could be used to expose his crimes. The challenge Martha faced was finding someone who would believe her accusations against Millfield's most respected physician. Henderson's reputation in the community was so strong that any accusations against him would likely be dismissed as the fantasies of a disgruntled employee. Martha needed to find undeniable proof of Henderson's guilt, evidence that would be convincing even to people who trusted the doctor completely. Martha's opportunity came when Henderson announced that he would be traveling to Augusta for a medical conference in early October. He would be away from Millfield for nearly a week, giving Martha unprecedented access to his private office and the evidence hidden there. She knew this might be her only chance to gather the proof needed to stop Henderson's killing spree, but she also understood that if she was discovered, the consequences would be fatal. The morning of October 7, 1844, dawned gray and cold as Martha Sullivan watched Dr. Henderson's carriage disappear down the dusty road toward Augusta. Her hands trembled as she turned the key to the clinic's front door, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether she could expose the most heinous crimes ever committed in Millfield, or whether she would become Henderson's next victim. Martha had spent sleepless nights planning her approach to searching Henderson's private office. She knew exactly where he kept his most sensitive documents, having observed his routines for months while pretending to go about her normal duties. The coded journal was hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his desk, while correspondence with insurance agents was kept in a locked drawer of his personal filing cabinet. Most importantly, the key to his special medicine cabinet was concealed behind a medical diploma on the wall. As Martha entered Henderson's private office, the familiar smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs took on a sinister quality. Every item in the room suddenly seemed like potential evidence of murder, from the pristine surgical instruments displayed on the wall to the neatly organized bottles of medicines that lined the shelves. Martha forced herself to work methodically, photographing documents with a camera she had borrowed from the local photographer and carefully copying key passages from Henderson's coded journal. The journal entries were even more horrifying than Martha had anticipated. Henderson had not only documented each murder in clinical detail, but had also recorded his thoughts and feelings about killing his patients. Some entries revealed a man who took perverse pleasure in the power he held over life and death, while others showed cold calculations about maximizing profits from each victim. One particularly chilling entry described Henderson's satisfaction at consoling a widow while knowing he had poisoned her husband just days earlier. Martha discovered that Henderson's crimes extended beyond simple murder for insurance money. The journal revealed that he had been conducting medical experiments on some of his victims, using different poisons and dosages to study their effects on the human body. Henderson viewed his patients as laboratory subjects, carefully documenting SYMPTOM and progression of poisoning to refine his techniques for future murders. He had developed detailed charts showing how different substances affected people of various ages, weights, and health conditions. The most disturbing discovery Martha made was a list of future victims that Henderson had compiled for the coming months. The list included 23 names of Millfield residents who had recently obtained life insurance policies or whose existing coverage made them attractive targets. Next to each name, Henderson had written notes about their health conditions, family situations, and the best approaches for gaining their trust. Some entries included detailed plans for eliminating entire families, while others focused on individuals whose deaths would appear most natural. Among the names on Henderson's target list, Martha was horrified to find her own. Henderson had apparently discovered that Martha carried a small life insurance policy through her late husband's employer, and he had noted that her position as his assistant made her both valuable and vulnerable. The entry next to Martha's name included observations about her growing suspicions and suggestions that her elimination might become necessary to protect his operation. Martha's hands shook as she photographed Henderson's target list, realizing that her investigation had placed her in immediate mortal danger. Henderson's notes indicated that he had been monitoring her behavior closely and had noticed her increased interest in his private affairs. The journal contained specific plans for poisoning Martha using medicines that would mimic common illnesses, allowing Henderson to claim that his faithful assistant had tragically succumbed to the same conditions that affected many of his patients. As Martha continued searching Henderson's office, she discovered a second hidden compartment containing correspondence with accomplices in other towns throughout Georgia and South Carolina. Henderson was not operating alone, but was part of a network of corrupt physicians, insurance agents, and undertakers who collaborated to defraud insurance companies and murder policyholders. The letters revealed that this network had been responsible for hundreds of deaths across the region, with each participant receiving a share of the profits from successful murders. The correspondence showed that Henderson held a leadership position within this criminal network, providing training and guidance to other physicians who wanted to adopt his methods. He had written detailed manuals describing poison selection, dosage calculations, and techniques for avoiding detection. Henderson had even traveled to other towns to conduct workshops for corrupt doctors, sharing his expertise in exchange for portions of their profits. Martha found evidence that the network maintained a sophisticated communication system that allowed members to share information about potential victims, coordinate their activities, and warn each other about suspicious investigations. They used coded language in their letters, referring to murders as treatments, victims as patients, and profits as medical fees. The codes were complex enough to avoid detection by casual observers, but simple enough for network members to understand and use effectively. One letter from a physician in Savannah revealed that the network had been operating for over 5 years and had generated profits exceeding $200,000. The writer expressed concern that their activities were becoming too widespread and might eventually attract attention from state authorities. But Henderson's response showed his confidence that their methods were virtually undetectable. Henderson argued that as long as network members maintained their reputations as respected physicians and limited their activities to carefully selected victims, they could continue operating indefinitely. Martha's most shocking discovery was a detailed accounting ledger that Henderson used to track his share of profits from the network's activities. The ledger showed that Henderson received payments not only from his own murders, but also from deaths carried out by other network members using his methods. He had essentially franchised his murder techniques, creating a steady income stream that supplemented the direct profits from his personal crimes. The ledger revealed that Henderson's total profits from murder exceeded $50,000, an enormous sum that had allowed him to live far beyond the means of a typical rural physician. He had used this money to purchase property in several states, invest in legitimate businesses, and build a fortune that would support him comfortably for the rest of his life. Henderson had transformed mass murder into a successful business enterprise that generated wealth while maintaining his respectable public image. As Martha photographed the ledger, she heard the sound of a carriage approaching the clinic. Her heart raced as she realized that Henderson might have returned early from his trip to Augusta, potentially catching her in the act of gathering evidence against him. Martha quickly returned the documents to their hiding places and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her discovery. But the visitor was not Henderson. Instead, Martha found herself confronting James Morrison, one of Henderson's mysterious evening visitors whom she had observed meeting with the doctor on several occasions. Morrison was a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself as an insurance investigator from Atlanta. His presence at the clinic while Henderson was away immediately raised Martha's suspicions about his true purpose. Morrison explained that he had been conducting a routine investigation of insurance claims in the Millfield area and wanted to review some of Henderson's medical records. He claimed that his company had noticed an unusual pattern of deaths among Henderson's patients and needed to verify that all claims had been processed correctly. Morrison's explanation seemed plausible, but Martha had read enough of Henderson's correspondence to recognize that this man was likely one of the network's accomplices rather than a legitimate investigator. Martha decided to take an enormous risk by testing Morrison's true identity. She mentioned that she had been concerned about some unusual patterns in Henderson's practice and asked if Morrison had noticed anything suspicious in his investigation. Morrison's reaction immediately confirmed Martha's suspicions. Instead of showing professional interest in her concerns, Morrison became visibly nervous and began asking pointed questions about what Martha had observed and whether she had discussed her suspicions with anyone else. Realizing that Morrison was trying to determine how much she knew about Henderson's crimes, Martha provided vague responses while carefully studying his behavior. Morrison's questions revealed that the network was aware of potential security risks and was actively monitoring for signs that their activities might be discovered. His presence at the clinic suggested that Henderson had asked him to check on Martha's activities while he was away, possibly as a prelude to eliminating her as a threat. The conversation with Morrison convinced Martha that she needed to act immediately to expose Henderson's crimes before she became his next victim. She had gathered enough evidence to prove Henderson's guilt, but she needed to find someone in authority who would take her accusations seriously and provide protection from the network's retaliation. Martha knew that local law enforcement might be compromised, given the network's apparent reach and influence. After Morrison left the clinic, Martha made copies of the most damning evidence she had discovered and hid them in locations where they would be found even if something happened to her. She wrote detailed letters explaining her discoveries and addressed them to authorities in Atlanta and Savannah, hoping that officials outside the network's immediate influence would be willing to investigate her claims. Martha's final preparation involved creating a comprehensive summary of everything she had learned about Henderson's crimes and the broader network of corrupt physicians. She documented the names of all victims she could identify, the methods used to kill them, and the profits generated from their deaths. She also included detailed descriptions of the network structure, communication methods, and plans for future murders. As night fell on October 7th, Martha realized that her life would never be the same. She had uncovered evidence of crimes so extensive and horrifying that exposing them would likely destroy the entire social fabric of Millfield. But she also knew that remaining silent would condemn dozens of innocent people to death at the hands of Henderson and his accomplices. Martha spent the sleepless night preparing for Henderson's return, knowing that their next encounter would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether she would become another entry in his coded journal of murder. Dr. Henderson returned from Augusta 3 days earlier than expected, his carriage rolling into Millfield under the cover of darkness on October 10th. Martha had barely finished securing the last of her evidence when she heard the familiar sound of his footsteps on the clinic's wooden floors. Her pulse quickened as she realized that Henderson's early return might not have been coincidental, but rather a deliberate attempt to catch her investigating his secrets. Henderson's demeanor when he entered the clinic was unlike anything Martha had observed before. Gone was his usual calm professionalism, replaced by a cold intensity that made her skin crawl. His eyes moved systematically around the room, searching for any sign that his private spaces had been disturbed. Martha forced herself to maintain normal composure while Henderson conducted what appeared to be a detailed inspection of his office and medicine cabinets. The tension in the clinic became unbearable when Henderson discovered that several documents in his filing cabinet were not arranged exactly as he had left them. Martha had been extremely careful to replace everything in its original position. But Henderson's obsessive attention to detail revealed the slight disturbances that indicated someone had accessed his private papers. His voice remained steady when he asked Martha about any visitors to the clinic during his absence, but his eyes held a murderous intensity that confirmed her worst fears. Martha provided a carefully rehearsed explanation about James Morrison's visit, describing him as an insurance investigator who had asked routine questions about patient records. Henderson's reaction to Morrison's name was immediate and telling. Rather than appearing surprised by an unexpected visit from an insurance official, Henderson showed relief that suggested Morrison's appearance had been prearranged. Martha realized that Morrison had been sent to monitor her activities, and his report to Henderson had likely confirmed that she had discovered too much about the murder network. Over the following days, Henderson's behavior toward Martha underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. He began assigning her tasks that kept her away from sensitive areas of the clinic, and he started locking doors that had previously remained open. Most ominously, Henderson began preparing special medications during evening hours when Martha was not present, a change in routine that suggested he was planning to eliminate her as a security threat. Martha's situation became even more precarious when she discovered that Henderson had been asking pointed questions about her personal life around town. Under the guise of concern for his assistant's welfare, Henderson had inquired about Martha's insurance coverage, her relationships with family members, and her general health condition. These seemingly innocent questions followed the exact pattern Martha had observed Henderson using with his previous victims, confirming that she had been selected for elimination. The breakthrough in Martha's desperate situation came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Robert Davis, who had served Millfield faithfully for over a decade, approached Martha with concerns about patterns he had been noticing in the town's mortality records. Davis explained that his duties as sheriff required him to maintain detailed records of all deaths in his jurisdiction, and he had begun to notice unusual correlations between deaths among Henderson's patients and recent insurance policy purchases. Davis revealed that his suspicions about Henderson had been growing for months, but he had lacked concrete evidence to justify an investigation of the town's most respected physician. The sheriff's military background had taught him to recognize patterns that others might miss, and the clustering of deaths among Henderson's wealthiest patients had triggered his investigative instincts. Davis had been quietly gathering information about Henderson's practice, hoping to find evidence that would either confirm or dispel his suspicions. Martha's decision to trust Sheriff Davis with her discoveries represented an enormous leap of faith. She had no way of knowing whether Davis was genuinely committed to justice or might be part of the corruption that seemed to surround Henderson's activities. However, Martha's desperate circumstances left her with few alternatives, and Davis's apparent sincerity convinced her to share the evidence she had painstakingly gathered. The meeting between Martha and Sheriff Davis took place in the basement of Davis's home, away from the prying eyes and ears that seemed to monitor every aspect of life in Millfield. Martha presented her evidence methodically, starting with her observations of Henderson's suspicious behavior and building toward the damning documentation she had discovered in his private office. Davis listened with growing horror as Martha described the full scope of Henderson's crimes and the network of accomplices that had enabled his murderous enterprise. Sheriff Davis's reaction to Martha's evidence exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Rather than dismissing her claims as incredible, Davis immediately recognized their significance and began planning a comprehensive investigation that would expose Henderson's crimes while protecting Martha from retaliation. Davis revealed that he had been corresponding with law enforcement officials in other Georgia counties who had expressed similar concerns about suspicious death patterns among certain physicians' patients. The sheriff's investigation quickly expanded beyond Millfield as Davis contacted colleagues throughout Georgia and neighboring states. His inquiries revealed that law enforcement officials in multiple jurisdictions had been noticing unusual mortality patterns among patients of physicians who were later discovered to be part of Henderson's network. Davis coordinated with these officials to share information and evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of the network's activities across the entire region. Davis's most crucial discovery came when he made contact with Detective Samuel Wright of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in Atlanta. Wright had been conducting a covert investigation of insurance fraud throughout the state and had identified several suspicious patterns that aligned perfectly with the evidence Martha had gathered about Henderson's activities. Wright's investigation had been hampered by the network's sophisticated methods and the respectable reputations of the physicians involved, but Martha's insider knowledge provided the breakthrough he needed. Detective Wright's involvement transformed the investigation from a local inquiry into a statewide operation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. Wright brought resources and expertise that far exceeded what Sheriff Davis could provide alone, including access to forensic specialists who could analyze the poisons Henderson had used and financial investigators who could trace the flow of insurance money through the network's complex payment systems. The joint investigation team faced enormous challenges in gathering evidence that would stand up in court against defendants who had carefully constructed reputations as pillars of their communities. Henderson and his accomplices had operated with such sophistication that proving their guilt required painstaking analysis of financial records, medical documents, and testimony from witnesses who were often terrified of retaliation. The investigators needed to build cases that were so airtight that even the most skeptical juries would be convinced of the defendant's guilt. Wright's team employed innovative investigative techniques that had never before been used in Georgia. Criminal cases. They brought in medical experts from universities in Atlanta and Savannah to analyze Henderson's treatment methods and identify the specific poisons he had used. Financial specialists traced insurance payments through multiple banks and business entities to document how profits from murders had been distributed among network members. Most importantly, the investigators used surveillance techniques to monitor communications between network members and gather evidence of ongoing criminal activities. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically when Wright's team discovered that Henderson's network had connections to similar operations in other southern states. The network had apparently grown from a local Georgia conspiracy into a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been responsible for hundreds of murders over several years. The investigators realized they were confronting one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history, requiring coordination between law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. As the investigation progressed, Martha found herself in an increasingly dangerous position. Henderson had become suspicious of her activities and had begun implementing security measures that suggested he knew his operation was under scrutiny. Martha was forced to maintain her normal work routine while secretly cooperating with investigators, a balancing act that required extraordinary courage and composure. The investigation reached a critical phase when Wright's team decided they had gathered sufficient evidence to begin making arrests. However, the complexity of the network and the risk that key suspects might flee required careful coordination to ensure that all major players could be apprehended simultaneously. The investigators developed a comprehensive plan that would involve coordinated raids in multiple states, designed to prevent network members from warning each other or destroying evidence. Martha's role in the final phase of the investigation was both crucial and terrifying. The investigators needed her to continue working normally to avoid alerting Henderson to the impending arrests, while also gathering final pieces of evidence that would ensure the strongest possible cases against all network members. Martha knew that discovery of her cooperation would mean certain death, but she also understood that her testimony would be essential for securing convictions against Henderson and his accomplices. The night before the planned arrests, Martha received a coded message from Sheriff Davis warning her that Henderson had discovered her role in the investigation and was planning to eliminate her immediately. The message instructed Martha to leave the clinic immediately and seek protection at a safe location where investigators could ensure her safety. As Martha prepared to flee, she realized that years of careful planning were about to culminate in a confrontation that would either bring justice for Henderson's victims or result in the destruction of everyone who had worked to expose his crimes. The coordinated arrests began at dawn on October 15, 1844, as law enforcement officers across 3 states simultaneously moved to apprehend members of Henderson's murder network. In Millfield, Sheriff Davis led a team of federal agents to Henderson's clinic, where they found the doctor calmly preparing for what would have been Martha Sullivan's final appointment. Henderson showed no surprise when the officers entered, suggesting that he had been expecting this moment and had prepared for the possibility of capture. Henderson's arrest revealed the full extent of his arrogance and calculation. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, Henderson initially attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming that the deaths of his patients had been tragic but natural occurrences. However, when Detective Wright presented him with copies of his own coded journal and detailed financial records, Henderson's facade crumbled. Rather than continuing to deny his crimes, Henderson began negotiating for leniency in exchange for information about the broader network. The interrogation of Henderson lasted for 3 days and produced confessions that shocked even experienced investigators. Henderson admitted to personally murdering 67 patients over a period of 2 years, generating profits that exceeded $75,000. He provided detailed descriptions of his methods, explaining how he had refined his poisoning techniques to avoid detection and maximize insurance payouts. Most chillingly, Henderson showed no remorse for his victims, describing their deaths as necessary business expenses. Henderson's cooperation with investigators was motivated not by conscience, but by his desire to minimize his own punishment while destroying his former accomplices. He provided comprehensive information about network operations, including the names of corrupt physicians in 8 different towns, insurance agents who facilitated fraudulent policies, and undertakers who helped conceal evidence of murder. Henderson's testimony revealed that the network had been responsible for over 300 deaths across the southeastern United States. The trials that followed Henderson's arrest created a sensation throughout Georgia and attracted national attention to the scope of medical murder for profit. Henderson's case became the first major prosecution of what would later be recognized as one of America's earliest examples of organized healthcare fraud. The evidence presented during the trials included not only Henderson's confessions and financial records, but also testimony from Martha Sullivan, whose courage in exposing the conspiracy made the prosecutions possible. Martha's testimony during Henderson's trial was both compelling and heartbreaking. She described her gradual realization that the physician she had worked with and trusted was systematically murdering his patients for money. Martha's detailed knowledge of Henderson's methods and her access to his private records provided prosecutors with evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional investigation. Her willingness to risk her life to expose Henderson's crimes was recognized by the court as an act of extraordinary bravery. The prosecution's case against Henderson was strengthened by the testimony of Elizabeth Crawford, the only known survivor of Henderson's murder attempts. Crawford had been targeted for elimination after purchasing a substantial life insurance policy, but had survived Henderson's poisoning attempts due to an unusually strong constitution and her family's decision to seek a second medical opinion. When her condition failed to improve under Henderson's care, Crawford's survival provided prosecutors with a living witness who could describe Henderson's methods from a victim's perspective. Henderson's trial revealed details about his crimes that horrified even the most experienced court observers. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Henderson had conducted experiments on his victims, varying poison dosages and methods to study their effects on different types of patients. Henderson had treated human beings as laboratory subjects, documenting their suffering in clinical detail while calculating the profits their deaths would generate. The financial scope of Henderson's crimes was equally shocking. Prosecutors demonstrated that Henderson had accumulated wealth equivalent to what a legitimate physician might earn over several decades, all generated through systematic murder. Henderson had used his profits to purchase properties, invest in legitimate businesses, and build a fortune that would have supported a luxurious lifestyle for the rest of his life. The court ordered the seizure of all assets connected to Henderson's crimes, with the proceeds distributed to the families of his victims. Henderson's trial also exposed the broader network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. Testimony revealed that local officials, including magistrates and coroners, had accepted bribes to overlook suspicious deaths and expedite insurance claim processing. Insurance agents had received commissions for selling policies to individuals they knew were likely to be murdered, while undertakers had been paid to conduct minimal examinations of deceased policyholders and avoid asking questions about unusual circumstances surrounding their deaths. The conviction of Henderson and his accomplices required innovative legal approaches that established important precedents for prosecuting complex criminal conspiracies. The prosecution successfully argued that all network members were equally responsible for every murder committed by the organization, regardless of whether they had directly participated in specific killings. This legal theory allowed prosecutors to secure severe sentences for insurance agents and other accomplices who had claimed they were unaware of the network's murderous activities. Henderson's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the families of his victims to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Dozens of family members testified about the impact of Henderson's crimes on their communities and their personal lives. Many described how Henderson had consoled them during their grief while knowing that he was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. The emotional testimony from victims' families helped ensure that Henderson received the maximum possible punishment under Georgia law. The court sentenced Henderson to death by hanging, a punishment that was carried out on March 3, 1845, before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators who had gathered to witness justice for his victims. Henderson's execution marked the end of one of the most extensive medical murder conspiracies in American history, but his case had lasting impacts on medical practice, insurance regulation, and criminal law enforcement throughout the United States. The Henderson case led to significant reforms in medical licensing and oversight that were designed to prevent similar crimes in the future. Georgia became the first state to require comprehensive background investigations for physicians seeking licenses, and to establish ongoing monitoring systems for identifying unusual patterns in patient mortality. These reforms served as models for other states and contributed to the development of modern medical regulation systems. Insurance companies also implemented new procedures for investigating claims and identifying potential fraud based on lessons learned from the Henderson case. Companies began requiring multiple medical opinions for large policy claims, conducting more thorough investigations of deaths among recently insured individuals, and sharing information about suspicious patterns across the industry. These measures significantly reduced opportunities for insurance-related murders while protecting legitimate policyholders. Law enforcement agencies throughout the South used the Henderson case to develop new techniques for investigating complex criminal conspiracies that cross state boundaries. The cooperation between Sheriff Davis, Detective Wright, and federal investigators established protocols for multi-jurisdictional investigations that became standard practice for major criminal cases. The success of the Henderson prosecution demonstrated the importance of federal involvement in cases where local corruption might compromise investigations. Martha Sullivan's role in exposing Henderson's crimes was recognized with a substantial reward from insurance companies whose claims had been fraudulently processed by the network. More importantly, Martha became a symbol of individual courage in confronting institutional corruption and medical abuse. Her willingness to risk everything to protect innocent lives inspired similar actions by other healthcare workers who suspected wrongdoing in their institutions. The Henderson Medical Practice building was demolished shortly after the trials concluded, with many residents believing that the structure had been too thoroughly tainted by the crimes committed there to serve any legitimate purpose. The site remained vacant for several years before being converted into a memorial garden dedicated to Henderson's victims. The memorial includes individual markers for each confirmed victim and serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable patients from those who would exploit their trust. The broader impact of the Henderson case extended far beyond criminal justice and medical regulation. The case became a catalyst for discussions about the ethics of medical practice, the responsibilities of healthcare providers, and the need for patients to be informed advocates for their own care. Medical schools throughout the country began incorporating discussions of the Henderson case into their curricula, using it to illustrate the fundamental importance of the physician's oath to do no harm. Henderson's crimes also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated, rural communities to exploitation by respected professionals who abused their positions of trust. The case demonstrated how criminals could operate with impunity for extended periods when their activities were shielded by professional reputations and community respect. This recognition led to improved communication between rural communities and external oversight authorities, reducing the isolation that had enabled Henderson's crimes. The legacy of Dr. William Henderson serves as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades, and that protecting society from such predators requires constant vigilance from ordinary citizens willing to risk everything for justice. Martha Sullivan's courage in exposing Henderson's crimes saved countless lives and established a precedent for healthcare workers who witness wrongdoing in their institutions. Her example continues to inspire individuals who face the difficult choice between personal safety and moral responsibility. The Henderson case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of medical murder in American history, providing researchers with unprecedented insight into the methods and motivations of healthcare professionals who violate their most fundamental obligations. The detailed records preserved from Henderson's trials continue to inform modern discussions about medical ethics, patient safety, and the detection of healthcare fraud. Today, visitors to Millfield can visit the memorial garden that stands where Henderson's clinic once operated. The peaceful setting provides a stark contrast to the horrors that occurred there, while serving as a lasting tribute to the 67 innocent people whose lives were cut short by one man's greed. The memorial ensures that Henderson's victims are remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose deaths contributed to important reforms that continue to protect patients throughout the United States. The story of Dr. Henderson's secret serves as both a historical account of one of America's most shocking crimes and a timeless reminder of the importance of individual courage in confronting evil. Martha Sullivan's decision to risk everything to expose Henderson's murders demonstrates that ordinary people have the power to stop even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises when they choose to act with determination and moral courage. Her legacy continues to inspire those who face similar choices between personal safety and the protection of innocent lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.